Welcome to Artificiality. This is Dave Edwards.
Hi, and this is Helen.
And we're trying something different with this episode. We're going to start off with a little bit of a conversation together, and then we're going to move on to a conversation with Ted Kwartler, the VP of Trusted AI from DataRobot. But we decided to do something different this week because Helen admitted to me that she's actually never listened to the podcast.
It's like you totally sabotaged.
Yes, I did because I think it's worth it.
I don't like the sound of my own voice.
Yeah, but you haven't listened to the ones that I've done by myself, where you're not on it either.
Oh, no, I've listened to some of those.
Oh, really?
I have indeed.
All right,
yes.
I'm sure. Okay, so let's talk about, I think, the big topic of AI for the week, or at least the one that has sort of captured our attention we were just talking about, which is the appointment of an oversight board at Facebook.
Yes, the ultimate. Well, I think it's the ultimate anachronism because you've got a group of people that are going to sit around and talk while the machines deliver content at the speed of light to the entire globe. So it sort of seems out of whack to me that this thing could ever actually do anything other than maybe act on a few things that are particularly bad or egregious, or kind of like just talk. So, I mean, how do you stall corporate innovation? You get big groups to get together to just talk.
Well, I like what you're talking about in terms of the speed of AI versus the speed of a group of people, of 40 people, right, from around the world judging the results of the machine. It feels to me something like you meet someone who's 25 and then you have a conversation about something that they did wrong or they learned incorrectly while they were in kindergarten. You know, so we're going to go back and we're going to reteach you that thing that you learned. Because by the time the oversight board gets around to actually looking at any of these things, they go up through some form of appeals process. The Facebook algorithms will have gone on to learn just an extraordinary amount of new things. How much can they actually go back and unlearn or rechange what it's learned?
It'll be, by the time there's any decision, it'll kind of be irrelevant.
Yeah.
And that's the concern. I mean, and if you look at where regulation works at this sort of scale and speed, it's by putting sensors into the data streams and having external people actually have some teeth.
Yes, I think that's true. And it is, and the sensors in the data streams allow organizations like the SEC to actually capture or to identify what they think may be illegal trading in near real time, or at least in near real time in comparison to what this Facebook oversight board is going to be able to capture. I also think what's interesting about this is it's such an odd management decision. I think, it's we're Facebook, we're the, smartest, most powerful people in the world, and we have, an extraordinary management team and an extraordinary board of directors, but we're not capable of having oversight of our own business. And so we're going to bring in a group of outsiders, and we're going to fund it with a huge endowment. I mean, they're putting a lot of money behind it. They've got plenty of it. But still, it's kind of odd to say we as an organization, as a management team and a board of directors are not capable of doing the job. And so we're going to appoint a group of other people who are going to do that job as part-time work. It doesn't seem like any of these people are leaving their jobs. It's not a full-time thing. It's every once in a while they get an oversight. I find that to be such an interesting choice.
Yeah, well, and the idea of an external oversight board can be pretty powerful.
Sure.
But it needs to actually match the problem and the solution. And we're kind of stuck on both sides in the sense that the problems are going to, any harm that is caused in Facebook will happen before people even notice it's happening. So by the time you get through this, really what's going to turn into a very convoluted process. I really feel like it's the machines laughing at the humans because it's going to bring out all of the most difficult things of human collaboration. And then at the other end of it, which I'm sure you'll be able to add to, is just the structural flaw in terms of the solution. And that it really does come down to, one person.
Yeah, I think, and there's one last part of this for me that's interesting, is The board represents people from all over the world. It's quite a global group, which I think is appropriate for a platform like Facebook. You want to have people from Senegal and Denmark and Chicago, or just three places I kind of remember, to be able to reflect the global reach of this platform. I wonder whether there's also some of that, which is a bit of a sort of an attempted a judo move for Facebook when being confronted by U.S. regulators, to be able to say, well, yes, we're a U.S. company, and yes, you have the rights to regulate us, but you realize you can't actually be an appropriate regulator because you as a U.S. regulator can't represent the global community that we serve. It's sort of saying we appreciate the interest of regulations from a single country or from the EU or something else, but really none of you can do the job the way a global oversight board can do it, and so we're going to create that ourselves.
So it's going to come down to actually how it works in practice, and what things come up through that board, how fast they're able to turn decisions around, and whether things actually genuinely binding in terms of its relevance. Yeah. So it's not inherently bad, other than sort of fending off regulation, but it's not guaranteed to succeed.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so let's move on to our conversation with Ted. Ted's at DataRobot. Why is DataRobot interesting to you?
Well, DataRobot's like super interesting because not only is it interesting because we all want to find ways to have more standardized approaches to developing the machine learning pipeline, because it's just easier and more efficient, and you don't have to sort of constantly sort of single out the expertise of one particular person. You're not so reliant on that. You can be much more scalable, and things can be cheaper and faster. I mean, that's the sort of some of what you talk about in the history of the internet. It's the sort of next phase of that. But what I think is really interesting about the approach is that it's able to standardize some of this approach to bias as well. So people don't have to reinvent the wheel every time when it comes to sitting down and figuring out what bias in AI is, because there's a big learning curve to actually go up there. And I think that this process of moving into much more standardized developments and standardized approaches can help take some of the learning curve and some of the noise out of it, out of these debiasing processes. Of course, the flip side is that if you go too far and you overly automate this process, then you take away the human judgment, or you sort of risk going on the other end of it. But I think that it makes sense to have much more streamlined, standardized approaches for things that are known sources of bias. That's
great. And I think that we had a great conversation with Ted. Very lively, a lot of meeting of the minds, but a lot of really interesting new ways of thinking of things. So let's leave it there and move on to our conversation with Ted.
Sounds great.
All right. Thanks for joining the podcast.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
Excellent. Maybe start out with just giving our listeners a bit of overview about DataRobot, what it is you do, who you work with, and a bit about the background of the company.
Sure. So DataRobot really kind of pioneered this concept of automated machine learning in 2012, 2013, came out of a group of founders that were in the insurance industry. And what they tried to do and were successful at was basically you could throw any, at the time, table data. So this is like a flat data file, and it would identify if this is text, if this is numeric, or if this is a factor like male, female, or ABC. And it would try and like fit maybe 40 different algorithms to it and help you identify which ones are the best ones. And so from there, that's our core product, creating this automated machine learning. So it takes out the need for these high-end data scientists, the PhD astrophysicists, and so on, or it supplements their work. And then from there, we've moved into data preparation, which is farther upstream, and also into actually delivering those models in an app through an API, which is downstream and actually derives the value. So within that kind of context of kind of a software play, all the way from data to implementation of a model, my team works in what we call trusted AI. And what we're concerned about is the responsible use of technology, adding guardrails to technology, making sure that people are using our software in an ethical manner. Those are the things that we are focused on pretty often, all day, every day, pretty much.
And how do you integrate that practice of helping people create trusted AI when you're operating as a service team and a service organization? So it's not your data, it's not your customer interaction, it's not your predictions. Your customers are bringing the data and using your system and your algorithms. So how do you help them create trusted AI, and how do you get them to be responsible for creating trusted AI?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. This type of software is very complex. And so we actually think about it in a couple different ways. First, we want to support people and our customers through actual training, where we cover these types of things in what we call DataRobot University, where we try and arm them with responsible uses. We also support them with AI success managers. So when you have an installation, we have a whole manager that helps you think about and project scope something appropriately. So that helps on like the qualitative side, which I think is very important. And on the technical side, we add guardrails in our app. So an analog would be flying an airplane, right? There's automated solutions for flying an airplane, but there are still safety measures and warnings that happen along the way so that the pilot can't take certain actions. And those are the types of things my team actually develops within the app, like the automatic detection of personally identifiable information, right? And we surface that as a warning to the practitioner, right? So it's both qualitative in terms of people support and then like a functional aspect of our app.
So when you're talking about that, that's like alert. Do you alert users to particular things that could bring in more bias or could bring in or unknown sources of bias so that people can make different choices around it as they're configuring models? Is that what you mean? Yeah.
So in terms of bias, I think in our research, we found something close to 24 different mathematical measures of bias. And one of the things that we're working on now is helping users identify which one would be appropriate for their use case. So having a workflow, if you know TurboTax, where it's just very common questions and it kind of feeds you and then leads you to an answer, that's where we want to get to. And that's the things that we're working on. And then we want to surface that in our app. So we would find, you should be concerned about statistical parity for your race column, for example, or gender column, making sure that you're treating these different parties statistically similar, which is important, particularly, let's say, in HR. And so not only would we lead them through that in a guided workflow, but then we would help them build models without it, or help them have different insights about what variables are contributing to that. You see problems like this in even the most sophisticated types of organizations. Apple just had their credit card with Goldman Sachs, and there was some gender bias that was apparent. And so if the most sophisticated technological organizations are having trouble with this, we think we have a duty to help people still on that train of maturity for AI to like wrap their heads around ways these can fail and also provide warnings.
Yeah, the Apple Card one was particularly interesting, and we followed that one quite extensively. It still seems that it's not entirely clear what the cause actually was.
Yeah, in terms of cause, obviously I'm not at Goldman or Apple, I don't know. But what we've noticed is that a lot of times you have what are called proxy variables. So a lot of times a data scientist who hasn't thought about these types of things, the high-end practitioner who's trained for I'm going to squeeze the most accuracy out of a model, is going to focus on the data that they think is important. But you can get proxies for different things. So if I'm bringing in resumes to screen them for different jobs, if I bring in text fields such as hobbies and I see football versus field hockey, those are proxies oftentimes for gender, right? You think height and weight oftentimes has some correlation to gender. And so that would be another example of a proxy feature. And so what's kind of interesting is if you build a model to predict gender and you throw in that data, you'll see what are the important variables. You'll see which ones are actually proxies for these protected classes. And that's something a lot of data scientists aren't comfortable doing, right? If you say, would you like to build a model that predicts gender? They would inherently say, no, that's unethical, right? But it is ethical if you're not using it for production, but using it to explain and understand and remove these features that can still lead to bias.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I think a lot of people, one of the things that's sort of hard to wrap your head around in this process is where does the statistical definition of something and an appropriate use of statistics stop and a process of discrimination start from any enterprise. How do you walk your customers through those sort of conversations?
Yeah, and I think that's the role of our customer-facing data scientists and also our AISMs that help with that. One of the things that we've spoken with chiefs of staff in the U.S. Senate with, we had the privilege of going down and helping them brief them on this type of work, is this concept of a social impact assessment, right? So yes, you can just spit out math and you say there's some measure of bias, right? But what's the social impact of what you're actually doing, and understanding if it's a high risk or critical issue, then you should have a social impact assessment as part of your project workflow. And you might say, oh, I don't need it for this project because it's very small. Well, one of my colleagues, Sarah Kotry, just wrote an article that got accepted in a journal related to online advertising and the algorithms choosing whether to show you high-end homes, right? And you think, oh, that's not showing bias, but it actually could be. If it's high-end homes and I'm using demographic information, I'm not even presenting people, let's say with people of color, with those ads. I'm demonstrating bias in what I'm showing them in terms of offering. And there are regulations around fair housing and fair lending and employment opportunities, right? And so even things like online advertising, there should be a social impact assessment. And that takes a business practitioner or a project manager, because oftentimes the data scientist is not going to look up from their Python code or their R code. A lot of times they're heads down and they're trained on building the model. You need someone with some sort of perspective on how to bring value to the business.
It makes a lot of sense how you talk about creating sort of a TurboTax style workflow for the people on the business side to be able to go through and identify where the problems might be. You put out a report based on a survey last year about bias and how companies were handling it. It struck me that there was such a high percentage of companies that have some sort of activity going on in trying to reduce bias. They clearly don't have a tool like yours that makes it easy for the subject matter experts to actually get involved in identifying it. I'm curious what you found about how people are actually handling bias today.
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say that they see a significant need because there's a lot of reputational and other business risk related to these missteps, right? Like I said earlier, Google's had missteps with machine vision. Amazon's had missteps with resumes. The judicial system and sentencing, there's been algorithms with missteps. So people understand that there's a gravity here. And CEOs 5 years ago were getting from their board pressure to add AI and machine learning into their business. And they did that, and a lot of times it was Wild West, and they popped the champagne when they got their first model into production. The reality is, because of this risk, because of these automated solutions, you do need these types of risk management processes. We talk a lot about 4 principles, one being having an ethical purpose, one that aligns to your organizational's ethos, right, as a first step. We talk about another tenet of fairness and bias. Make sure that you have an understanding of fairness and bias and how it could creep into your model and how you've mitigated that risk, right? Disclosure, from our perspective, we want to disclose to AI producers, AI validators, AI management, and even the downstream person impacted. So it's almost a persona-centric. We want to disclose information to them. And we want to do it in a way that's palatable to them. And then finally, we want to have this being a governed workflow, right? It can't just be Ted churning out a single model, pushing it into production without anyone helping to validate it. Going back to those kind of personas that I talked about, when you apply for credit and you're denied, you have the right to go get your credit score and look at your credit report. And that's providing information to the person that's impacted, the reasons behind that decision. And so whenever possible, we ask organizations, we counsel organizations to go through those extra efforts around disclosure and think about it from a persona. A lot of data scientists, a lot of our peer companies, they think about disclosure more in the strict sense of what needs to be disclosed to the data scientist from a technical perspective, which is important. Certainly, that's a major persona. Like you have to have Shapley values to understand feature impacts. Certainly, that's important. But if I hand the average person a Shapley value or a lift chart, they're going to have trouble interpreting it, right? And so I think for us, thinking about disclosure along these different personas is very important.
Yeah, I'm interested in what you found out about how people like AI to explain itself and what establishes trust versus what it doesn't.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's this belief that you need AI needs to be transparent. And I actually don't think that AI needs to be transparent in the sense that I need to hand you my source code. Some of these algorithms at the very deep technical level, they're a bunch of weak learners, meaning there's thousands of simple decision trees. And if I hand that to someone, even myself, if I start reviewing that individually, that's not going to be that helpful. Right? And so I don't need fully transparent AI. I need it to actually be explainable for me in the way that makes sense to me as a particular persona. Because without it, you're going to have people just rolling their eyes, or their eyes are going to glaze over, or I can't tell you how many times in my prior career, a data scientist would be in front of an executive and they go into high-end parameter tuning, Bayesian optimization kind of discussions, and the executive's lost. The executive is data fluent, but not going to follow that type of discussion. They want to know the value to their business. They want to understand the risks to their business and how those risks have been mitigated.
So how do you help people figure out the difference? I like what you're saying about explainability, that it can be, you don't have to understand exactly what's going on at the root level, if you will. Mm-hmm. It's more sort of the impact level is what it.
Yeah.
Right. How do you figure out where that line is?
Sure.
That like I think about a totally non-AI analogy, like I've got a photo and I press the auto magic button that makes everything look better. I don't know exactly how it's doing it. I don't understand how it's looking at the photo to understand what should change, but it does show me how all the little sliders change, right? So the white balance change, the color balances change. And so I'm seeing the impact, and the impact is being explained. What led to that impact isn't being explained, and that's okay for me. That's okay for me in that persona as a person, using that system. How do you think about? You're dealing with much more complex, data sets and predictions.
Yeah. But think about this in your example. How many times have you played with those knobs and you start washing it out and making it all dark and everything in between, right? I think that is important, giving people the opportunity to rationalize the outcome, and it takes experience to do that. And in that example, giving you the sliders and not just correcting it and saying, there you go, it's all corrected, but giving you the opportunity to change those things. You don't have to look at the individual pixel level values, right? Because that's too much depth. That's too much granularity, right? But giving you that slider helps you rationalize and intuit the understanding. Same as if I was interviewing someone to join my team, I don't ask for a CT scan so I can look at their synapses. It doesn't help me, right? But I probe, I ask questions, I ask for tell me about a time when, blah, 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 right? The same can be done as you interrogate a machine learning algorithm, where I can feed it synthetic data with an outlier and see what happens. I can see what the average predictions are, right? And these are things that are still probing and still understanding, and helps me come to a rationalized, intuitive understanding of how this thing is going to behave. And then on top of it, at least in our system, we talk a lot about humble AI, which is when can a machine learning algorithm that's in production have appropriate guardrails where we can set up a rule that's an override a prediction, right? There's all sorts of reasons for why you would want to do this, both business and also let's say I build an algorithm and I'm using income as some feature. And in my training data, I happen to pull in Bill Gates, right? So his income is very high. That's definitely going to affect my algorithm, right? And so maybe I want to, if the data scientist doesn't remove outliers as part of EDA, maybe I want to box in those predictions and say, I have to keep them within this safe range for my business or within this safe range for society. And so we talk about humble AI. How can I demonstrate humility as this algorithm versus us just merely accepting them at the prediction outcome and moving on from there? Because I think that's dangerous territory.
Yeah, does humble AI encompass conversations about how to make, if it's required, make trade-offs between a predictive value and some of the ethical considerations?
Well, I would say that our thinking on that is definitely evolving. In terms of so again, this is something that today we think about humble AI as define a rule and adjust the prediction and override a prediction. That rule could have something to do along with ethics. But we actually think that ethics should be kind of throughout that entire life cycle versus humble AI is really around at the moment of prediction. How do we adjust the prediction based on our understanding of the business problem? And that understanding can include ethics, right? And so we can set up rules that say, when it's someone who's of very low income, for instance, how do we adjust that prediction to make it fair on them? Whatever this prediction outcome may be. But that takes understanding throughout and really at the project scoping phase.
Yeah, so that's more at the level of understanding the full context that the AI is operating within, including human accountability and expectations.
Yeah, and that goes back to what I talked about around having kind of like a governed workflow where you have multiple people kind of thinking over the whole project and thinking about fairness, thinking about bias, and governed in the sense that we have these approval workflows and we have this person did all the data prep and there's this data provenance and we understand where this data came from and Ted signed off on it and then Helen does all the modeling and here's the design decisions that she made. Having that governed and approval before it goes to, let's say, a production environment is very important, right? So there has to be kind of this explainability and thought about fairness and trust kind of underwriting an entire project lifecycle.
Who do you
Without it, you're inviting a lot of risk, I think.
Who do you find is driving that process? So you're incorporating ideas around ethics and fairness, which haven't been part of the conversation for IT organizations because it hasn't been part of it, except for perhaps certain regulated industries, right? So we talk about financial services. They've had to deal with those issues for a long time. But now there's new companies and new industries that are finding that they're having to grapple with ethical issues. Who is it who's driving that conversation with your customers? Yeah,
I think to your comment about regulated industries, that's what I would call is contractual trust. That's like the basic form. That's actually a form of non-trust. Society doesn't trust finance, so we have to enforce contractual trust on them, right? And so in those organizations, that has to be driven by either a chief data officer or a chief compliance officer. Being honest, more truthfully, I see this being at the project owner level, if it's done at all. One of the things I like the business owner that's going to drive this singular project forward would actually be implementing and enforcing a lot of this risk management stuff. But some of these other organizations they have, especially in the form of contractual trust, they have whole organizations that need to support it, right? And so you would want someone dispatched from a compliance organization into your machine learning library or machine learning team. We have major banks as clients that they review every model that comes out of DataRobot. The compliance team does. And so they're enforcing that contractual trust. But my feeling is if the compliance team is already finding a problem, that means upstream the choice was made about that decision to build that type of model or make that type of algorithm. And the design choices should be solved ahead of time whenever possible.
What sort of, when you talk about the choices that are made upstream, one of the things that we hear a lot from people is that it's really tough to take a standard software development process and put an AI or an ML process on top of it because there's just different decisions to be made. It's harder to predict the state of development and how long things might take, and some of these, even just evaluating false positives and false negatives and fairness metrics is an entirely different thing. How do you coach customers who are new to AI through that change?
I think this is one of the areas where DataRobot really shines, is the democratization and standardization of the process. Most data science organizations right now are custom coding, where I'm the data scientist, I'm coding in R, and Helen, you and I are sitting next to each other, and you might be in Python, and you're making different design choices, and I'm making different design choices, and we both throw it over the fence to IT. And so that's why it's super hard for IT to think about this as a normal software build, right? But if you have the ability to structurally standardize this build, like in certain ways, I'm not saying DataRobot's the only company that does this, but certainly we're one of the strongest, where it's a data ingest process that's governed, it's standardized workflows and what we call blueprints, and then the models themselves are exposed in standardized, authenticated MLOps products, like as an API. That makes it more of a standard build. If you're not doing it, you're getting this Wild West where someone who's a better coder is coming up with something. Someone who's a weak coder, data scientist, may take 6 months to come up with an algorithm that's still not as good. And it could be coded in a notebook and not able to be put into production. So it is very difficult. I think there was this rush to find this unicorn, these data scientists, and in doing so, they forgot about democratizing it and standardizing this kind of workflow.
Yeah. So if that's the barrier you guys have busted, what's the barrier you need to bust?
That's a great question. So one of the things that I think we can do a better job at is helping the data scientists that are embedded in an organization not feel threatened by our software. Our software, again, is an automated solution. So oftentimes you get a couple different reactions, one of which is this automated solution is not nearly as good as my modeling, or you put me out of a job. And what we actually counsel people on is that no matter if you have a fast AI decision, like we're serving a banner ad, or a slow AI decision where I'm using the decision for a medical diagnosis, where it's the outcome of the algorithm is augmenting a human decision, there's a role for human beings and data fluent data scientists throughout, no matter that entire spectrum. In the terms of fast AI decisions, we have people that have to govern and understand these processes and update it, because data always gets stale, and rebuild these models over time. And then obviously with slow decisions where it's a medical condition that's being diagnosed, you still want a human in that loop to help augment that decision, or ultimately make that impactful decision. And so my understanding, and one thing that I think we can break through, is not to have people feel threatened. If you're told for the last 10 years that you're a unicorn, you command a huge salary, and you have the sexiest job of the decade, according to Harvard, you don't necessarily like a piece of software that does something similar to you automatically, right? And so we need to break through that kind of initial reaction and allow people to understand that they can add a lot of value using our software, even being non-technical as well as very technical.
Well, and I think that the sorts of things that we've been talking about, we can do all of those things better, right? We can understand more about proxy discrimination better. So and bringing a data scientist to the table to have that conversation, as well as a lawyer or a product manager or an executive, that actually just makes the solution better, and everyone's still got absolutely. A job.
Yeah. I tell my students at Harvard that data science is really a team sport. To do it right is a team sport. Otherwise, you're inviting extra risk. You need to be thinking about those things, and also, just approaching problems differently and solving something for the business and adding value to customers, helping them is an interdisciplinary project at its heart. Right? You can't just operate in a vacuum. Even if you're the most brilliant data scientist, at some point you have to hand that model off to get into a production environment, right? And that's at the very basic, let alone all these other things we've talked about.
And there's obviously plenty of cases where the data scientist doesn't want to be responsible for the outcome alone, Right, you want this to be a team sport because you want everyone to be bought into what the outcome of these systems will be, so that everybody's sharing the responsibility of it.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I actually had never heard of the phrase "throw it over the fence" until I was on a machine learning research team at a different company, and one of the best modelers I'd ever talked to and worked alongside, he said, "Oh, I just take my model and throw it over the fence at IT." And then that team wondered why their models took over a year to actually get into production, right? Because IT inherits something that they have no idea what it is. They have to rewrite it in a different language and so on. So I think it's important that the data scientist does not operate in a silo, both from accountability and actually deriving value for the business too.
Oh, that's a fascinating. Oh, this could be an entire rabbit hole. But one of the things that's always nice to sort of poke at in your own knowledge sometimes is, where do I believe something that seems to be counter to all best practice? And at the moment people say, well, the best way to start an AI. The best way to start an AI project is to start on something little and muck around with it with one person and then prove some value. And I'm looking at that advice thinking, it just doesn't seem to make sense to me, because it actually, all it does is promote this over the wall kind of thinking.
Yeah, you get a lot of academic, what I call curiosity analysis that way. You get endless notebooks and endless PowerPoints. Here's what we learned. Here's what we learned. When I was on that machine learning research team at a different company, I spent 10 months on one project, and it was fascinating. I learned a lot about coding, and I learned a little bit about the segment of the business I was looking at, but I wasn't doing anything. It wasn't actually going to impact customers. And so I think it's a fascinating place where we're at, where we have people who want to just sit in a silo, sit in the ivory tower and code around and get all the data. And what you end up getting is models that may be interesting, may be helpful anecdotally, but never make it into a production environment. I recently wrote an article for Dataversity where I said a dark day is coming for data scientists, because they need to ask themselves, how many of the models have I built have actually made it into production? And that's super important, because that's where value is made. And I mean that, like, not just in a monetary sense. That's saved time for customers. That's improved patient outcomes. The real impact of this technology. And so if they don't start thinking like a team, and they don't start addressing like ethical purpose and fairness and disclosing it according to different personas, and then doing it in a team kind of atmosphere, interdisciplinary kind of project, I think you're just going to always run into this risk where I throw it over the fence. No one seems to ever do anything with it, right?
Well, there's in some ways, to me, there's a historical issue in that there's some percentage of people, some percentage of data scientists in corporate settings today who got into the field of data science not intending to be in a corporate setting. They got into it to get a PhD and to be an academic, and then they came out of their program and they got offered these really big jobs with big salaries, and they said, well, let's go do that. But their mindset and their love of the science was not intended to be put to use in production. It was intended to go discover something and to find an interesting outcome. And that's a really worthy goal. We actually, in some ways, need some of those data scientists to go back to academia, right? But we need to sort of parse the field. Those who want to really go pursue the front end, go back to academia and go do that, because that's the purpose of academia. In addition to teaching, right? But then we need the others who are really interested in putting stuff into production to be focused on that.
Yeah, absolutely. How many primary source physics particle accelerators are there? So how many PhDs do we need in that field? Or they can go make $500,000 at a hedge fund. Yeah. It's like, oh, okay. All right. I guess I'll go do that, right? So we have this kind of perverse incentives societally where you do have people, what I say is like the love of modeling. They just heads down. I just love modeling and trying to unlock this pattern and make the most accurate model. That's not always what's best for society. And I think having these other people surround those people can help guide one of these projects through to actually deriving value.
Do you guys think much about, or what do you think about the discussions of AI and its effect on human agency and choice?
Well, there are definitely impacts to human choice. I had a student, I briefly mentioned that before we started recording, that the impact of chatbots, whether or not the chatbot was making a recommendation and declared itself as a chatbot. To me, the ethical thing there is to disclose that you are speaking not to a human being. You see on Instagram these literally fake spokespeople. Companies are using computer-generated spokespeople because there's less brand risk, right? You think about the horrible thing with Subway and that spokesperson that happened, right? But if it's a computer-generated, I control that message and everything there. And so I think that there's a real need to think organizationally about what's comfortable and possibly even regulation that's necessary. I think that those are two things that are definitely going to affect the adoption of these. The other thing I always talk with my students about is understand the incentives of these organizations building algorithms. Every semester in my ethics paper that I have people write, people always say how wonderful recommendation engines are. It impacts my life because I watch better things on Netflix. It impacts my life because I find what I need faster on Amazon. I will grant you that is 100% true. However, there's another kind of dark side to these types of things. If I'm reading news in a curated feed, it's curated and I don't have the agency necessarily. I'm just going to accept that it's trying to enrich my life. But that may not be the case. It may just be trying to capture my eyeballs and feeding me in an echo chamber with the same type of information that I would be most responding to. And so I think that there's a real kind of double-edged sword to these things as we think about things that are meant to improve our life, but also could be taking away choice, right? In the case of Spotify is very good because they'll present you with music that you like, but every once in a while give you a song and understand how you're going to behave if you actually like that song that is not normally in your recommendations, in an effort to try and broaden your horizons, right? Because if I'm only being presented with what I want, I end up in this circle, this kind of feedback loop, and I don't actually have agency. So I think like Spotify has thought about it the right way. I'd like to think that the news feeding organizations or recommendation aggregators, they would be doing something similar. Because I do think that it's a real worry for society.
My mind is just spinning with a million more things that we could go, and because it's certainly something that we think about a huge amount, like everything from the surveillance capitalism end right through to just a very simple personalization prediction algorithm for what someone might want to order in a store.
Yeah. And if you think about a recommendation engine, it helps me find whatever I was looking for perhaps faster. But also, when does it go past the point of manipulation and now I'm actually spending more money than I should, right? I don't really need that thing and I'm just being bombarded, right? And I think that is a real worry for people who are less sophisticated, just accepting recommendations, particularly around news. And you see that if you use Google News, they're using some of your search history to populate your Google News, right? And that's fine, except many of us are using proxies for whether we're left of center, right of center, and other attributes about us. And we will be confronted or presented with the same information that Google wants to find relevant. So they're finding relevancy for us. But there is value in sometimes a little less than perfect relevancy in terms of me making a choice and being exposed to new information and new ways of thinking, particularly.
I like your recommendation to your students that they focus on the business goal of the organization, because if you look at YouTube, the goal of that organization is to keep your students watching. And so, that recommendation algorithm has a big impact on their life because they're spending many, many more hours just glued to YouTube because it's offering up the thing that'll keep you watching. Because that's the goal. Once you understand that, you have a little bit more sort of. I have at least a bit more skepticism when I look at what's up, recommended in my feed for YouTube to go. Why do they think I'm going to watch that? And maybe I'm just going to mess with it by not watching that. To try and break the system.
Dave, I would say you are right to be critical of these things, and I think it comes from a good place for the Googles and otherwise. but most, I would argue, the common kind of U.S. consumer, or maybe just generally consumer, does not think that critically about it, right? One of the things I always ask students is, why do you think Google decided to try and do self-driving cars? Why did they put 10 years and billions of dollars into that? And a lot of times people say, oh, because they're a good company and things like that. The reality is they want to free up your eyeballs. They realize they can get billions of hours of commute time. They want to free up your eyeballs, which will literally, they know will a certain amount of that time you'll spend on a phone or a tablet Googling things, which means more ad revenue for them, right?
Yeah.
So the incentives behind some of the algorithm development are not always transparent, and students have not thought through that. But I do have to say, like, I don't think that there's on the whole, that there's a malicious intent either at Google or any of these larger companies. I think what's exciting is that this technology can help society, but it has to have some critical eyes kind of governing that entire ethical paradigm overarching a lot of these projects.
This has been great. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Dan.
I think that we could go on for hours. But thank you very much for joining us. It's been a great pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely. My pleasure. If you guys need anything, let me know. And I'm always happy to talk about AI ethics or trusting in these technologies. Absolutely. So you guys have a great day.
Thanks. You too.
You too.
Be well.
Spilling solid state.